thought she'd be spending the night alone on the dark streets of Boston. But when a mysterious millionaire detective crosses her path, everything changes. What secrets does he hold? And why can't she shake the feeling that this meeting was more than coincidence? Thank you so much for watching, and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The rain fell in relentless sheets across the cobblestone streets of Boston, turning the evening of November 12, 1897, into a canvas of gray and shadow. Eleanor Grace Whitmore stood beneath the iron and glass canopy of South Station, her gloved hands clutching a worn leather valise, her heart sinking with each passing moment. The great clock tower above her head showed 9:30, and the last train to Providence had departed 15 minutes earlier. She had missed it. Eleanor closed her eyes, fighting back the trembling that threatened to overtake her composure. At 26 years old, she prided herself on being practical, resourceful, a woman who had learned to navigate the world alone after her father's passing 3 years prior. But tonight, everything had gone wrong. The omnibus had lost a wheel on Tremont Street. The driver had been apologetic but unhelpful, and now she stood stranded in a city that felt suddenly vast and unwelcoming, with nowhere to go and precious little money in her reticule. The station was emptying rapidly. Porters wheeled their carts toward the service entrances. Well-dressed travelers hurried toward waiting carriages, their umbrellas blooming like dark flowers against the rain. Eleanor felt the weight of isolation pressing down upon her shoulders, and for the first time in years she felt truly helpless. "Miss, the station will be closing soon," a gruff voice informed her. A uniformed attendant stood nearby, his expression not unkind but firm. "You'll need to find accommodation elsewhere." Eleanor nodded, unable to trust her voice. She stepped out from beneath the canopy, feeling the cold rain immediately soak through the shoulders of her modest navy traveling coat. The street stretched before her, slick and treacherous, the gaslights casting wavering reflections in the puddles. She had no idea where to find a respectable boarding house at this hour, and the thought of wandering these unfamiliar streets alone sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the weather. She had taken perhaps 20 steps when she heard footsteps behind her, measured and purposeful. Eleanor's spine stiffened, her hand tightening on her valise. She quickened her pace, but the footsteps matched her rhythm. "Forgive me, miss," a deep, cultured voice called out. "I don't mean to startle you, but I couldn't help noticing you missed the Providence train." Eleanor stopped and turned, her breath catching in her throat. The man who stood before her was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet 2 inches, with broad shoulders that filled out his impeccably tailored charcoal suit. His overcoat, fine wool with a subtle herringbone pattern, hung open despite the rain, as if the weather were merely an afterthought. But it was his face that held her attention. Strong, angular features softened by remarkably kind gray eyes, dark hair swept back from a high forehead, and an expression of genuine concern that seemed to radiate warmth despite the cold evening. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," Eleanor managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "How do you know where I was going?" The man's lips curved into a slight, apologetic smile. He raised one hand in a gesture of peace. "I was standing near the ticket counter when you inquired about the next departure. I assure you I'm not in the habit of following young ladies through train stations. My name is Alexander James Lockwood. I'm a private investigator, and I was here on business when I noticed your predicament." He reached into his coat and produced a leather card case, extracting a business card which he offered to her. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before taking it. The card was elegantly engraved, "Alexander J. Lockwood, Private Investigations," with an address on Beacon Hill. "A detective?" Eleanor asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. She had read about such men in the newspapers, often portrayed as shadowy figures of dubious morality. "I prefer investigator," Alexander said with a hint of humor in his voice. "And I understand your caution. A woman alone, approached by a stranger in the rain. It's hardly a scene to inspire confidence. But I noticed you have nowhere to go tonight, and I couldn't in good conscience simply walk away." Eleanor studied him carefully. His clothing spoke of considerable wealth, his manner of perfect education and breeding. There was something about his direct gaze, his open expression, that suggested honesty. Still, years of caution held her back. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Lockwood, but I'm perfectly capable of finding accommodation on my own," she said, lifting her chin with more confidence than she felt. "Of course you are," Alexander agreed readily. "But it's nearly 10 o'clock on a rainy November night. Most respectable boarding houses will have locked their doors by now, and a woman of your obvious refinement should not be wandering the streets alone at this hour. The city can be dangerous, especially in the neighborhood surrounding the station." As if to punctuate his words, a group of rough-looking men emerged from a nearby alley, their voices loud and slurred with drink. Eleanor instinctively took a step back, and Alexander moved slightly, positioning himself between her and the men without making it obvious. His presence alone seemed to deter them, and they stumbled past, their raucous laughter fading into the rain. "You're not alone tonight," Alexander said quietly, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "Please allow me to help you find proper lodging. My aunt runs a very respectable boarding establishment on Commonwealth Avenue. She caters exclusively to single ladies and maintains the highest standards of propriety. I can take you there, introduce you properly, and ensure you have a safe, warm room for the night." Eleanor felt her resistance wavering. There was something in his voice, a sincerity that touched something deep within her, and truthfully she had no other options. The rain was growing heavier, her clothes were soaked through, and the station behind them had gone dark. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" she asked, searching his face for any hint of deception. Alexander was quiet for a moment, as if considering his answer carefully. 3 years ago, my younger sister found herself in a similar situation in Philadelphia. A stranger helped her when she needed it most. I've never forgotten that kindness, and I've tried to honor it by offering the same to others when I can. There was a depth of emotion in his words that struck Eleanor as profoundly genuine. She made her decision. "Very well, Mr. Lockwood. I accept your kind offer, but I insist on paying for my room." "Naturally," Alexander agreed with a warm smile that transformed his serious features. "My aunt wouldn't have it any other way. She's quite particular about maintaining independence for her guests." He gestured toward the street where a handsome black carriage waited, drawn by 2 bay horses and driven by an elderly man in a Macintosh coat. "That's Henry, my driver. He's been with my family for 30 years and has impeccable discretion. May I take your bag?" Eleanor hesitated only briefly before allowing him to take her valise. As they walked toward the carriage, she became acutely aware of his height, his presence beside her both commanding and oddly comforting. When they reached the vehicle, Alexander opened the door and offered his hand to help her inside. The moment her gloved hand touched his, even through the layers of fabric, Eleanor felt an unexpected jolt, a current of awareness that traveled up her arm and settled somewhere near her heart. Their eyes met, and for one suspended moment, the rain and the darkness and the city itself seemed to fall away. Alexander cleared his throat and stepped back, allowing her to settle into the plush interior of the carriage before climbing in opposite her. He rapped twice on the roof, and the carriage lurched gently into motion. "I should introduce myself properly," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "My name is Eleanor Grace Whitmore. I'm a teacher at the Providence Academy for Young Ladies. I was visiting a former colleague here in Boston and intended to return home this evening." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Whitmore," Alexander said, his gray eyes studying her with an interest that seemed to go beyond mere politeness. "A teacher. That's admirable work." "It provides independence," Eleanor replied, "which I value greatly." "As you should," Alexander agreed. There was something in his tone that suggested he genuinely respected her position, rather than viewing her employment as a mark of reduced circumstances, as many men of his obvious social standing might. They rode in silence for a few moments, the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves and the rain against the carriage roof creating an oddly intimate atmosphere. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at her unexpected benefactor, noting the intelligence in his features, the slight lines around his eyes that suggested a man who observed the world carefully. "You said you were at the station on business," Eleanor ventured. "May I ask what sort of investigation brings a private detective to South Station on a rainy Tuesday evening?" Alexander's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "I'm afraid the details are confidential, but I can tell you it involves a missing person. A young woman disappeared 3 weeks ago, and her family hired me to find her. The trail led me to Boston." "How dreadful," Eleanor said, genuine sympathy in her voice. "Was she traveling alone?" "That's what I'm trying to determine," Alexander replied. "She purchased a train ticket but never arrived at her destination. Somewhere between Boston and New York, she simply vanished. A chill ran through Eleanor that had nothing to do with her damp clothes. That's terrifying. Do you think something happened to her on the train? It's one possibility, Alexander said carefully. Though in my experience, disappearances are rarely as mysterious as they first appear. Usually there's a logical explanation, if one knows where to look. The carriage turned onto Commonwealth Avenue, and Eleanor gazed out at the elegant row houses, their windows glowing with warm lamplight. This was clearly one of Boston's most fashionable neighborhoods, far removed from her own modest circumstances. Your aunt must run quite an establishment, Eleanor observed. Mrs. Harriet Pemberton, Alexander said with obvious affection. She's my father's elder sister and absolutely formidable. After her husband died, she refused to sit idle in mourning. She purchased the house 15 years ago and has been providing sanctuary for respectable women ever since. She's quite selective about her guests, actually. You should feel honored. I'm merely grateful, Eleanor said quietly. The carriage drew to a stop before a magnificent 4-story brownstone with a black iron fence and a garden that even in November showed signs of meticulous care. Alexander climbed out first and offered his hand once more to assist Eleanor. Again, that strange awareness passed between them, and Eleanor found herself reluctant to let go. They ascended the steps together, and Alexander used an ornate brass knocker to announce their arrival. Within moments, the door swung open to reveal a dignified woman in her early 60s, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, her black silk dress both fashionable and proper. Her keen blue eyes took in the scene before her with obvious intelligence. "Alexander," she said, her voice cultured but warm. "What have you brought to my doorstep this time?" "Aunt Harriet, may I present Miss Eleanor Grace Whitmore? She missed the last train to Providence and finds herself in need of accommodation for the evening. I assured her that you maintain the finest establishment in Boston for ladies of quality." Harriet's sharp eyes assessed Eleanor thoroughly, but not unkindly. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, for her expression softened into a welcoming smile. "Miss Whitmore, you look positively frozen. Come inside at once." "Alexander, you may leave her bag in the foyer and be on your way. Miss Whitmore doesn't need you hovering about." Despite the dismissal in her words, there was clear affection between aunt and nephew. Alexander set down the valise and turned to Eleanor. "I hope you'll rest well, Miss Whitmore. Perhaps our paths will cross again." "Thank you, Mr. Lockwood," Eleanor said, meeting his eyes. "I'm truly grateful for your kindness." For a moment, neither moved. Then Alexander bowed slightly and stepped back into the rain, and Eleanor found herself watching until his carriage disappeared into the darkness, feeling strangely bereft. Eleanor woke to weak November sunlight filtering through lace curtains, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The room Mrs. Pemberton had provided was modest but beautifully appointed, with rose-patterned wallpaper, a carved mahogany bed, and a writing desk positioned near the window. For a long moment she lay still, replaying the events of the previous evening in her mind. Alexander Lockwood. Even his name carried a certain weight, a solidity that matched the man himself. Eleanor had spent half the night trying to convince herself that her reaction to him had been merely gratitude, that the flutter in her chest when their hands touched had been nothing more than relief at finding help in a desperate situation. But in the honest light of morning she could no longer deny the truth. Something had passed between them, something she had never experienced in all her 26 years. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Whitmore, are you awake?" Mrs. Pemberton's cultured voice called. "I've brought tea and some toast. May I enter?" "Yes, please," Eleanor said, quickly smoothing her borrowed nightgown and sitting up against the pillows. Mrs. Pemberton entered carrying a tray, her expression as composed as it had been the night before, though her eyes held a hint of curiosity. She set the tray on the bedside table and poured a cup of steaming tea with practiced efficiency. "You slept late," she observed, not unkindly. "It's nearly 10 o'clock. I suspected you needed the rest after your ordeal." "I apologize," Eleanor began, but Mrs. Pemberton waved away her concern. "Nonsense. That's precisely why I maintain this establishment. Women need places where they can simply be without judgment or expectation." She settled into the chair near the window, arranging her burgundy morning dress with precision. "Now, tell me, Miss Whitmore, what are your plans?" "The next train to Providence departs at 2 o'clock this afternoon." Eleanor sipped her tea, grateful for its warmth. "I'll take that train, of course. I must return to the academy." The students will be expecting me tomorrow morning." "A teacher," Mrs. Pemberton said with approval. "My nephew mentioned as much. It's respectable work, though I imagine the compensation is modest." "It provides for my needs," Eleanor replied with quiet dignity, "and I find it fulfilling." Mrs. Pemberton's sharp eyes softened. "I meant no disrespect, my dear. In fact, I admire women who forge their own paths. Too many of your generation still wait passively for a husband to determine their fate." She paused, studying Eleanor with disconcerting intensity. "You're not waiting for such rescue, I take it?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm quite content with my independence, Mrs. Pemberton." "Content," the older woman repeated, as if testing the word. What a lukewarm sentiment. But perhaps that's the safest course. She rose from her chair with surprising grace. "I'll have Annie draw you a bath. Your clothes have been dried and pressed. You'll want to look presentable for the journey." After Mrs. Pemberton departed, Eleanor finished her breakfast and then luxuriated in a proper bath, the first she'd had in days. As she dressed in her navy traveling suit, now miraculously restored from its rain-soaked state, she tried to push thoughts of Alexander Lockwood from her mind. Their encounter had been a brief intersection of circumstance, nothing more. She would return to Providence, resume her teaching, and remember the previous evening as a curious adventure, a moment of unexpected kindness from a stranger. Yet even as she told herself this, she found her thoughts returning to his gray eyes, the genuine concern in his voice when he'd said, "You're not alone tonight." At 12:30, Eleanor descended the stairs to find Mrs. Pemberton waiting in the foyer, but she was not alone. Alexander Lockwood stood beside his aunt, dressed in a dove-gray suit that emphasized his impressive physique. When he saw Eleanor, something flickered in his expression, something that made her pulse quicken. "Mr. Lockwood," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I didn't expect to see you again. I took the liberty of calling on my aunt this morning," Alexander explained, his deep voice sending an unexpected warmth through her. "When she mentioned you were taking the 2 o'clock train to Providence, I realized we have a remarkable coincidence. My investigation has led me to Providence as well. I'll be taking the same train." Eleanor's heart leaped in a way that had nothing to do with coincidence and everything to do with the prospect of spending more time in his company. "How extraordinary," she managed. "Isn't it?" Mrs. Pemberton said dryly, her knowing gaze moving between them. "My nephew rarely visits me during the day, yet here he is, offering to escort you to the station. Such devoted attention to propriety." Alexander had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, though his eyes never left Eleanor's face. "Aunt Harriet, you know very well that I wouldn't allow Miss Whitmore to navigate the city alone after what happened last evening." "Of course not," Mrs. Pemberton agreed, though her tone suggested she saw through his reasoning entirely.
"Well then, you'd best be on your way. The streets are still damp from last night's rain, and traffic may be slow." In the carriage once more, Eleanor found herself acutely aware of Alexander's presence across from her. The interior seemed smaller somehow, more intimate, though nothing physical had changed. She searched for something to say, some topic that would ease the tension that stretched between them like a silk thread. "This investigation you mentioned," she began, grateful for neutral ground. "The missing woman. Has your trail truly led to Providence? Or was that perhaps an exaggeration for your aunt's benefit?" Alexander's lips curved into a smile that transformed his serious features. "You're perceptive, Miss Whitmore. The truth is somewhere between complete fabrication and absolute fact. I do have business in Providence, though it could have waited another day or two. I chose to prioritize it because—" He paused, and for the first time since she'd met him, he seemed uncertain. "Because I found I couldn't let you travel alone without knowing you'd arrived safely." The honesty in his admission stole Eleanor's breath. "Mr. Lockwood, Alexander," he interrupted gently. "I think after last evening's adventure we might dispense with such formality, don't you? At least when we're in private." "Alexander," Eleanor repeated, finding she liked the shape of his name in her mouth. "Then you must call me Eleanor, though I'm not sure propriety would approve of such familiarity after such brief acquaintance." "Propriety," Alexander said with a hint of amusement, "has never been overly concerned with the realities of human connection. Sometimes, Miss Eleanor, two people simply recognize something in each other, something that transcends the usual social boundaries." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly in her lap. "And is that what you think has happened? Between us?" Alexander leaned forward, his gray eyes intense.
I think that from the moment I saw you standing in the rain, looking lost and brave and beautiful all at once, something shifted inside me. I think that a sensible man would have simply directed you to my aunt's establishment and gone about his business, but I'm discovering I'm not nearly as sensible as I believed. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones, carrying them through Boston's busy streets, but Eleanor barely noticed the world beyond their small enclosed space. "I'm not sure what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Alexander assured her. "But perhaps you'll allow me to sit with you on the train, and perhaps, if you're willing, you might tell me more about yourself. I find I'm extraordinarily curious about you, Eleanor Grace Whitmore." Before Eleanor could respond, the carriage lurched suddenly, throwing her forward. Alexander's hands shot out to steady her, catching her shoulders with surprising gentleness, despite his obvious strength. For a moment, they remained frozen, his hands warm through the fabric of her coat, their faces mere inches apart. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "No," Eleanor breathed. "I'm fine." But neither of them moved. Eleanor could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, could smell the subtle scent of his cologne, something woody and masculine. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Eleanor," Alexander said softly, and her name on his lips was like a caress. "I need you to know that my intentions are entirely honorable. I'm not a man who trifles with women's affections." "I believe you," Eleanor said, and she did. Everything about him spoke of integrity, of strength tempered with gentleness. The carriage slowed, and Alexander reluctantly released her, sitting back as they pulled into South Station. The spell broke, but something had fundamentally changed between them. They both felt it, this shift from strangers to something more, something neither could quite name but both recognized as significant. As they walked through the station together, Eleanor noticed how people's gazes followed them, how women looked at Alexander with admiration and men with a mixture of respect and envy. He was the sort of man who commanded attention simply by existing, yet all his attention seemed focused entirely on her. On the train, Alexander secured them seats in a relatively private section of the passenger car. The compartment was elegantly appointed, with burgundy velvet seats and polished brass fixtures. As the train pulled out of Boston, gathering speed through the industrial outskirts, Eleanor felt the strangest sense of rightness, as if she were exactly where she was meant to be. "Tell me about your work," Alexander said, settling back in his seat with genuine interest. "What made you become a teacher?" Eleanor considered how much to reveal, then decided on honesty. "My father was a professor of literature at Brown University. He believed passionately in education, especially for women. When he died 3 years ago, he left me with very little money but a considerable education. Teaching was the most respectable path available to me, and I discovered I genuinely loved it." "You have no other family?" Alexander asked gently. "My mother died when I was 12. My father never remarried. It was just the two of us for many years." Eleanor gazed out the window at the passing landscape. "He taught me to value independence, to think critically, to question assumptions. I'm not sure he realized he was preparing me to be alone." "You're not alone," Alexander said quietly, and Eleanor's eyes flew to his face. "That is, you don't have to be. Alone, I mean." The intensity in his gaze made Eleanor's breath catch. "Alexander, we've known each other less than a day." "I'm aware of that," he said with a slight smile. "And I'm also aware that I've never felt this way before, so quickly, so certainly. I'm 32 years old, Eleanor. I've met many women, been courted by mothers with marriageable daughters, attended countless social functions. But I've never felt compelled to follow a stranger through the rain, simply because I couldn't bear the thought of her being alone." Eleanor's heart raced. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'd like permission to call on you properly, to court you, if you'll allow it. I know it seems precipitous, but I believe in trusting one's instincts, especially when they speak as clearly as mine are speaking now." Before Eleanor could respond, the train's whistle blew sharply, and the car suddenly lurched with a grinding screech of brakes. Passengers cried out in alarm as the train shuddered to an unexpected stop, throwing people against their seats. Alexander immediately moved to shield Eleanor, his arm coming around her protectively. "Are you all right?" he demanded. "Yes," Eleanor gasped. "What's happening?" Through the window they could see they'd stopped in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest on both sides. The conductor hurried through the car, his face pale. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. There's been an obstruction on the tracks. We're investigating now. Alexander's expression shifted, becoming alert and focused in a way that reminded Eleanor he was an investigator, a man trained to notice details others might miss. An obstruction, he murmured, or something more deliberate. Alexander rose from his seat with fluid grace, his expression sharp and assessing. Stay here, he told Eleanor firmly. I'm going to investigate. Absolutely not, Eleanor said, standing as well. If something suspicious is happening, I'm not sitting here wondering. Besides, you said yourself I'm not alone. A flicker of admiration crossed Alexander's features before he nodded. Very well, but stay close to me. They made their way through the passenger car, passing bewildered travelers who murmured anxiously among themselves. The conductor stood near the exit, blocking passengers from disembarking. Sir, I must ask everyone to remain in their seats, the conductor said, his voice strained. Alexander produced a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing an official-looking badge. Alexander Lockwood, private investigator. I'm authorized to assist in matters of public safety. What's the nature of the obstruction? The conductor's relief was palpable. Thank goodness. Mr. Lockwood, there's a large tree trunk across the tracks. The engineer says it didn't fall naturally. It was placed there deliberately. And there's something else. He lowered his voice. We found a woman's traveling case near the obstruction, partially hidden in the brush. It's been there a while by the look of it. Eleanor felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the November cold. She watched as Alexander's jaw tightened, his gray eyes growing distant as he processed this information. The missing woman from your investigation, Eleanor whispered. Could it be connected? That's what I intend to find out. Alexander replied grimly. He turned to the conductor. Has anyone touched the case? No, sir. The engineer spotted it and had the sense to leave it alone. Good man. I need to examine both the obstruction and the case. Miss Whitmore will accompany me. The conductor looked uncertain. Sir, the lady is under my protection and has relevant skills, Alexander said with quiet authority. Eleanor blinked in surprise but said nothing, curious where he was leading. She has an exceptional eye for detail. Now, if you'll excuse us. They descended from the train into the cold afternoon air. The forest pressed close on either side of the tracks, a mixture of bare oaks and evergreen pines that created deep shadows despite the daylight. The massive tree trunk lay across the rails like a fallen giant, its placement too perfect to be accidental. Someone used considerable effort to drag this here, Alexander observed, examining the ground around it. See the marks in the earth? Multiple people, working together. This was planned. Eleanor knelt near the edge of the clearing, her teacher's instinct for observation kicking in. Alexander, look here. There are footprints in the soft ground, partially obscured by leaves. 3 distinct sets, I think. 2 large, 1 smaller. Alexander joined her, his expression impressed. You weren't exaggerating about that eye for detail. You're right. 3 people at minimum. He followed the trail of disturbed earth. They came from that direction, through the trees. They moved deeper into the forest, Eleanor gathering her skirts to navigate the undergrowth. 20 yards from the tracks, they found the traveling case, a once elegant piece of luggage now stained with weather and dirt. Alexander knelt beside it, pulling on a pair of thin gloves he'd produced from his coat pocket. Standard practice, he explained, noticing Eleanor's curious look. I've learned not to disturb evidence with my bare hands. He carefully opened the case. Inside were women's clothes, neatly folded despite their exposure to the elements. A monogram on a silk blouse caught Eleanor's attention. JMR. Josephine Marie Radcliffe, Alexander said quietly, his voice heavy. The woman I've been searching for. She disappeared 3 weeks ago on a train journey from Boston to New York. He carefully lifted each item, examining them. These are expensive clothes, custom-made. Her family is quite wealthy, which is why they could afford to hire me. But why would her case be here in the middle of nowhere? Eleanor asked, though dread was already forming an answer in her mind. Alexander's expression was grim as he continued searching the case. At the bottom, wrapped in a chemise, he found a small leather-bound journal. He opened it carefully, reading the final entries. Listen to this, he said, his voice tight. October 28th. I can no longer live the lie Father has arranged for me. Tomorrow I leave Boston, but not for New York as everyone believes. Thomas will meet me in Providence. We will go west together, where no one knows us, where his lack of fortune won't matter, where we can finally be happy. I pray Father will forgive me someday, but I cannot marry Mr. Ashworth simply because father wishes it. I choose love over duty." Eleanor felt her heart clench. She was eloping. "It would seem so," Alexander agreed, continuing to read. "But there's more. October 29th, evening. Something is wrong. Thomas didn't meet me at the Providence station as planned. I waited for 3 hours. I'm taking a room at a small inn near the docks. Perhaps his letter went astray. He'll come tomorrow. He must." Alexander looked up, his gray eyes troubled. "That's the last entry. So she never went west," Eleanor said slowly. "She waited in Providence for a man who never came. The question is why," Alexander said, carefully placing the journal in his coat pocket. "Did Thomas abandon her? Did something happen to him? Or," he paused, his expression darkening, "or did someone ensure he couldn't meet her?" A sound in the forest made them both freeze. Footsteps, deliberate and approaching. Alexander immediately positioned himself in front of Eleanor, his hand moving to his waist where she now noticed a small revolver tucked into his belt. 2 men emerged from the trees, both rough-looking and wearing the simple clothes of laborers. They stopped when they saw Alexander and Eleanor, their expressions shifting from surprise to calculation. "Well now," the taller of the two said, his voice carrying a distinct Irish accent. "What have we here? Bit far from the train, aren't you folks?" "We're investigating the obstruction on the tracks," Alexander said calmly, though Eleanor could feel the tension radiating from him. "I'm a private investigator. This is my associate. We found this case and we're examining it as evidence." "Evidence of what?" the second man asked, taking a step closer. He was stockier than his companion, with a scar running down his left cheek. "That's official business," Alexander replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Now I suggest you gentlemen return to wherever you came from. This is a matter for the authorities." The tall man laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Authorities? That's rich. You know what I think? I think you're poking your nose where it doesn't belong. Some things are better left buried." The phrase sent ice through Eleanor's veins. Buried. Did they mean it literally? Alexander's hand moved fractionally closer to his revolver. "I think you've said quite enough. Miss Whitmore, we're returning to the train. Now." But as they turned, 3 more men emerged from different directions in the forest, effectively surrounding them. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest as she pressed closer to Alexander. "You're not going anywhere," the scarred man said. "Not until we have a conversation about what you think you know and who you might tell." Alexander's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "I'm armed, and I'm a very good shot. I suggest you reconsider your current course of action." 5 against 1? The tall man scoffed. "I like those odds." "You're forgetting someone," Eleanor said suddenly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "The conductor knows we're out here. If we don't return shortly, he'll bring help. The engineer as well. That's 7 witnesses who know you've been lurking in these woods. Whatever you're hiding, assaulting us won't help you hide it." The men exchanged uncertain glances. Eleanor pressed her advantage, channeling every ounce of authority she'd developed commanding classrooms of unruly students. "Furthermore, if something happens to us, Mr. Lockwood's investigation will simply be continued by another detective. His office knows where he is. His family knows where he is. You'd be adding assault or worse to whatever crime you're already guilty of. Is that really the intelligent choice?" The tall man's jaw clenched, but Eleanor could see doubt flickering in his eyes. Alexander used the moment to draw his revolver smoothly, holding it with practiced ease but not quite pointing it at anyone. "The lady makes excellent points," Alexander said coolly. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to let us return to the train. We're going to report everything we've found here to the proper authorities. And you gentlemen are going to have a choice. Disappear before those authorities arrive, or stay and explain what you know about Josephine Radcliffe's disappearance." "We don't know nothing about no missing woman," the scarred man said quickly, too quickly. "Then you have nothing to fear from the authorities," Alexander replied. "Step aside." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, with visible reluctance, the men shifted, creating a narrow path. Alexander kept his revolver ready as he guided Eleanor past them, his free hand gentle but firm on her elbow. They walked quickly but didn't run, Eleanor's heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Only when they were within sight of the train did Alexander holster his weapon. "That was remarkably brave," he said quietly, admiration clear in his voice. "And incredibly foolish. You could have been hurt. So could you." Eleanor countered, her voice shakier now that the immediate danger had passed. Besides, you said I wasn't alone. I took that to mean we face things together. Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Despite everything that had just happened, despite the danger they'd just escaped, his expression held something that made Eleanor's breath catch. Eleanor Grace Whitmore, you are extraordinary. Before she could respond, he took her hand, and even through their gloves, that electric connection sparked between them. When this is over, when we've found out what happened to Josephine Radcliffe, I'm going to court you properly. I'm going to call on you every Sunday, bring you flowers, take you to concerts and art exhibitions. I'm going to do everything society demands because I want everyone to know that I'm trying to win your heart. Trying, Eleanor whispered. Alexander, I think you've already succeeded. The confession hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Alexander's eyes darkened with emotion, and he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that seared through the fabric of her glove. Then we have something worth fighting for, he said, and I promise you, we will get to the bottom of this mystery. Together. They returned to the train to find the conductor anxiously waiting. Alexander quickly explained what they'd discovered, and the conductor immediately sent word ahead to Providence to alert both the railway authorities and the local police. As the crew worked to clear the obstruction, Alexander and Eleanor returned to their compartment. The other passengers had settled somewhat, though an undercurrent of nervous energy persisted throughout the car. Tell me what you're thinking, Eleanor said once they were seated. About Josephine. About those men. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his analytical mind clearly working through the puzzle. Josephine came to Providence to meet her Thomas. He never appeared. Those men in the forest clearly know something about her disappearance. The question is what? And why leave her case there, partially hidden but not completely destroyed? Perhaps they wanted it to be found eventually, Eleanor suggested, to make it look like she'd been in an accident, fallen from the train perhaps? Possibly, though that seems unnecessarily complicated. Alexander frowned. There's something we're missing, some piece that would make all of this make sense. The train lurched back into motion, finally continuing toward Providence. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself studying Alexander's profile as he stared out the window, lost in thought. In less than 24 hours, this man had become central to her world in a way she couldn't fully explain. The logical part of her mind insisted it was impossible to feel so much so quickly, but her heart knew differently. Eleanor, Alexander said suddenly, turning to her, when we reach Providence, I'll need to visit the police station immediately. But after that, may I call on you? At your residence properly? I live at the academy, Eleanor explained. I have a small apartment in the faculty residence. It's modest, but the headmistress is quite progressive about allowing female teachers to receive gentlemen callers in the common parlor, with proper supervision, of course. Of course, Alexander agreed with a slight smile. Then I'll call tomorrow evening, if that's acceptable. I have a feeling this investigation is going to occupy most of my time, but I'll make time for you, I promise. I'd like that, Eleanor said softly. Very much. As Providence came into view through the train windows, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of anticipation and apprehension. They were about to step from the protected bubble of their train compartment into the real world, where mysteries waited to be solved and dangers lurked in shadows. But they would face it together, and somehow, that made all the difference. The Providence police station was the imposing brick building on Fountain Street, its gas lamps already lit against the gathering November dusk. Eleanor waited in the carriage while Alexander went inside to make his report, her mind replaying the events of the past day like scenes from a dramatic novel. 24 hours ago, she had been a solitary teacher returning home from a simple visit. Now she found herself entangled in a mystery involving a missing heiress and somehow, impossibly, falling in love. When Alexander emerged 40 minutes later, his expression was troubled but determined. He climbed into the carriage beside her, and Eleanor noticed the weariness around his eyes. What did they say? She asked gently. Detective Sergeant Morrison is a competent man, thankfully. He's already familiar with Josephine Radcliffe's case. Her father filed a missing person report 3 weeks ago when she failed to arrive in New York. Alexander rubbed his temples. Morrison is sending men to search the area around where we found the case. He's also agreed to let me continue my investigation, provided I keep him informed. And the men in the forest? They'll be looking for them as well, though I suspect those particular gentlemen have already disappeared into whatever hole they crawled out of. Alexander turned to face her fully. Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I want complete honesty. The seriousness in his tone made her heart quicken. Of course. Are you truly comfortable with me continuing to involve you in this investigation? After what happened today, I realize I've been unfairly drawing you into something potentially dangerous. You have your position at the academy to consider, your reputation. If you'd prefer I conduct my inquiries alone from this point forward, I would understand completely. Eleanor considered his words carefully, recognizing the concern behind them. But she also recognized something else, an attempt to protect her that, while well-intentioned, underestimated her resolve. Alexander, she said firmly, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not a delicate flower that wilts at the first sign of adversity. I stood beside you in that forest because I chose to. I'm choosing now to help you find answers for Josephine Radcliffe, wherever those answers may lead, unless you'd prefer I didn't. A slow smile spread across Alexander's face, transforming his tired features. I'd prefer nothing more than to have you as my partner in this, if you're certain. I'm certain, Eleanor confirmed. Now where do we begin? Alexander pulled out Josephine's journal, handling it carefully. We begin with Thomas. If we can find him, or discover what happened to him, we'll be much closer to understanding what happened to Josephine. The journal mentions they plan to meet at the Providence station. Perhaps someone there remembers seeing them, or seeing her waiting alone. It's late now, Eleanor observed, noting the darkness settling over the city. But the station will be busy tomorrow morning. We could make inquiries then. We could, Alexander agreed. But there's someone else I'd like to speak with tonight, if you're willing. Josephine's journal mentions staying at an inn near the docks. There aren't many respectable establishments in that area. If we can find where she stayed, the innkeeper might have information. Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness but pushed it aside. Then let's not waste time. The dock district of Providence was a world away from the elegant neighborhoods Eleanor typically frequented. Narrow streets twisted between warehouses and taverns, the air thick with the smell of salt water, fish, and coal smoke. Alexander kept Eleanor close as they navigated the uneven cobblestones, his hand protectively at her elbow. They inquired at 3 different inns before finding the right one, a narrow 3-story building wedged between a ship chandler's shop and a boarding house. The sign above the door read, Mercy's Rest Inn, in faded letters. Inside, the small lobby was clean if shabby, warmed by a coal fire and a modest fireplace. Behind the desk sat a woman in her 50s, her steel-gray hair pulled back severely, her sharp eyes assessing them immediately. We don't rent rooms by the hour, she said flatly. This is a respectable establishment. I'm certain it is, Alexander said smoothly, producing one of his cards. My name is Alexander Lockwood. I'm investigating the disappearance of a young woman who may have stayed here approximately 3 weeks ago. Her name is Josephine Radcliffe. The woman's expression shifted from suspicion to something more complex, a mixture of concern and wariness. You're not the first to come asking about Miss Radcliffe. Her father's men were here 2 weeks back, throwing their weight around, making accusations. I'm not making accusations, Alexander assured her. I'm simply trying to find out what happened to her. Did she stay here? The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Mercy Hawthorne, studied them both for a long moment before nodding slowly. She did. Checked in on October 29th, late afternoon. Sweet girl, clearly well-bred, though she was trying to hide it. Paid for 3 nights in advance. Did she say why she was in Providence? Eleanor asked gently. Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze softened slightly at Eleanor's tone. Said she was waiting for someone. A gentleman friend, I gathered, though she was discreet about it. She seemed nervous, kept watching the street from her window. Did anyone come to see her? Alexander pressed. Not that I saw. She went out twice during the day, probably to the station or telegraph office. Came back both times looking more anxious. Mrs. Hawthorne's expression grew troubled. On the 3rd night, October 31st, she went out around 8 o'clock in the evening. Never came back. Left all her things in the room. Eleanor and Alexander exchanged significant glances. Do you still have her belongings? Alexander asked. Her father's men took most of it, but there was one thing they missed, or maybe didn't think was important. Mrs. Hawthorne reached under the counter and pulled out a small envelope. This was wedged behind the desk in her room. I found it when I was cleaning after they'd searched the place. Alexander took the envelope carefully. It was addressed to Josephine in a masculine hand, with no return address and no postmark, meaning it had been delivered by hand. He opened it and read aloud, "My dearest Josephine, forgive me for not meeting you as planned. Circumstances have changed in ways I could not have foreseen. Your father knows about us. He sent men to ensure I understood the consequences of pursuing you. They made it clear that if I attempt to see you, harm will come not just to me but to my family. I cannot risk my sister's safety, my mother's well-being. I am a coward, I know, but I am a coward who loves you enough to let you go. Return to Boston. Marry Ashworth. Forget me. It is better this way. I am so very sorry. Thomas." The words hung in the air, heavy with betrayal and heartbreak. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, imagining young Josephine reading those words, her dreams of love and freedom crumbling. "She received this letter?" Alexander asked Mrs. Hawthorne. "Must have. It was in her room. My guess is it was delivered while she was out, slipped under the door perhaps. And after she read it, she went out and never returned," Eleanor said softly. "But where did she go? What did she do?" Alexander's expression had grown cold, controlled fury evident in the set of his jaw. Her father hired thugs to threaten Thomas. Josephine discovered the man she loved had abandoned her, that her father had destroyed her chance at happiness. She was alone in a strange city with no money, no prospects, and nowhere to go. "You think she harmed herself?" Mrs. Hawthorne said quietly. "I've wondered the same. There's a bridge not far from here, over the Providence River. It's a place where desperate people sometimes go." "No," Eleanor said suddenly, with conviction that surprised even herself. "I don't believe Josephine took her own life." Both Alexander and Mrs. Hawthorne turned to her in surprise. "What makes you say that?" Alexander asked. Eleanor's mind was racing, pieces falling into place. Her journal, the last entry, was filled with hope, with determination to wait for Thomas. Even if she received this letter, a woman who wrote those words wouldn't simply give up. She'd be angry, yes. Heartbroken, certainly, but not defeated. She turned to Alexander. "And there's something else. Her traveling case, the one we found near the train tracks. You said her clothes were neatly folded inside." Alexander's eyes widened as he understood. A woman planning to end her life wouldn't carefully pack her belongings first, and the case was too far from any bridge or river to have been carried by water. Someone else put it there. "But who?" Mrs. Hawthorne asked. "And why?" "To create a false trail," Alexander said, his investigator's mind working rapidly. "To make it appear she'd been traveling and met with an accident, but they didn't account for the journal or for this letter." He looked at Eleanor with undisguised admiration. "You're brilliant." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest but kept her focus on the mystery. So if Josephine didn't harm herself, and she didn't run away, what happened to her that night? Alexander turned back to Mrs. Hawthorne. "You said her father's men came here. Can you describe them?" "3 of them, rough types, trying to look respectable in cheap suits. The leader was tall, had an Irish accent, scar on his face." Mrs. Hawthorne paused. "Wait, you don't think—" "I think Mr. Radcliffe hired those men to frighten Thomas, yes. But I'm beginning to suspect they did more than that." Alexander's expression was grim. "I think when Josephine left this inn on October 31st, she encountered those same men. Perhaps they were watching the inn, waiting to report back to her father. Perhaps she confronted them, demanded to know where Thomas was. And they took her," Eleanor finished, horror dawning. "They took her to prevent her from creating a scandal, from revealing what her father had done." "But where?" Alexander demanded. "Where would they take her?" Mrs. Hawthorne's face had gone pale. "There's an old warehouse on the waterfront, about half a mile south of here. It's owned by Radcliffe Shipping Company. I've heard rumors over the years about that place, about how men who cross the Radcliffes sometimes disappear. I always thought it was just dock gossip. But now—" Alexander was already moving toward the door. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I need you to send someone to the police station immediately. Tell Detective Sergeant Morrison what you've told us. Tell him to meet us at the Radcliffe warehouse with as many men as he can gather." "Alexander, wait," Eleanor said, catching his arm. "You can't just rush in there. If you're right, if those men are holding Josephine, they've had 3 weeks to hide her. They might—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the terrible possibility that Josephine might already be dead. But Alexander understood. His hand covered hers, warm and strong. "I know the risks, but if there's even a chance she's alive, I have to try." Every moment we delay is another moment she's in danger. Then I'm coming with you, Eleanor said firmly. Absolutely not. Eleanor, this is different from following me through a forest in daylight. These men have already proven they're willing to commit violence. I won't risk you. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. You said we were partners. You said we face things together. Were those just pretty words, Alexander? For a moment he looked torn between his desire to protect her and his respect for her autonomy. Finally he nodded, but his expression was serious. You stay behind me. You do exactly as I say. And if I tell you to run, you run. Agreed? Agreed, Eleanor said, though she had no intention of leaving him if things turned dangerous. The warehouse loomed against the night sky, a hulking shadow of brick and timber. Most of the windows were dark, but a faint light flickered on the second floor. Alexander approached cautiously, Eleanor close behind him. The front entrance was chained and padlocked, but they found a side door that hung slightly ajar. Inside, the warehouse smelled of mildew, rotting wood, and something else. Something unpleasant Eleanor couldn't quite identify. Alexander lit a small lantern he'd procured from Mrs. Hawthorne, keeping the light dim. They moved through a maze of crates and abandoned equipment, following the sound of voices from above. A rickety staircase led to the second floor. Alexander tested each step carefully before putting his full weight on it. At the top, they found themselves in a long corridor with several doors leading off it. Light and voices came from the room at the far end. They crept closer, pressing themselves against the wall. Through the gap in the doorway, Eleanor could see 3 men gathered around a table playing cards. She recognized 2 of them from the forest, including the tall Irishman and the scarred man. 3 weeks we've been babysitting that girl, one of them complained. When's the old man going to decide what to do with her? When he's good and ready, the Irishman replied. Our job is to keep her quiet and out of sight. He pays well enough for it. She stopped eating, the third man said nervously. Been 3 days now. She just sits there staring at the wall. It ain't natural. Then let her starve, the scarred man said callously. Makes our job easier if she does herself in. Eleanor felt Alexander tense beside her, rage radiating from him in waves. She touched his arm gently, reminding him to stay calm, to think strategically. They were outnumbered and couldn't risk a confrontation until help arrived. But fate had other plans. At that moment, Eleanor's foot caught on a loose board, creating a loud creak that echoed through the corridor. The voices in the room stopped abruptly. What was that? One of the men demanded. Someone's here, another said. Check the corridor. Alexander grabbed Eleanor's hand and pulled her back toward the stairs, but it was too late. The men burst from the room, and within seconds, they were surrounded. Well, well, the Irishman said, recognition dawning on his face. The detective from the train should have dealt with you then. Alexander positioned himself between Eleanor and the men, his revolver drawn. Step aside. The police are on their way. This is over. Nothing's over until we say it is, the scarred man snarled, pulling out a wicked-looking knife. What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion. The third man lunged at Alexander, who fired a warning shot that splintered the wood beam above their heads. The men hesitated, clearly not expecting him to actually shoot. In that moment of confusion, a weak voice called out from one of the other rooms. Help! Please, someone help me! Josephine, Eleanor breathed. The sound of the young woman's voice, desperate and afraid, seemed to galvanize everyone simultaneously. Alexander fired again, this time aiming at the Irishman's shoulder. The man went down with a cry of pain. The scarred man charged with his knife, but Alexander was faster, sidestepping and bringing the butt of his revolver down on the man's wrist. The knife clattered to the floor. The third man, seeing his companions defeated, turned and fled down the stairs. Eleanor heard his footsteps pounding through the warehouse below, then the sound of the door crashing open. Moments later, shouts and whistles filled the air. The police had arrived. Alexander kept his revolver trained on the 2 injured men, while Eleanor rushed to the room where the voice had come from. She found Josephine Radcliffe huddled in a corner, thin and pale, her once fine clothes hanging on her frame. But she was alive. Miss Radcliffe, Eleanor said gently, kneeling beside her. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. You're safe now. We're going to take you home. Josephine's eyes filled with tears. Thomas, she whispered. Where's Thomas? Eleanor's heart broke for her. I don't know, dear, but we're going to find out. I promise you. The next hour was a chaos of police activity. Detective Sergeant Morrison arrived with 6 officers, taking the men into custody and securing the warehouse. A police doctor examined Josephine and declared her physically weak but not seriously harmed. Alexander gave his full report, including his suspicions about Mr. Radcliffe's involvement. "That's a serious accusation," Morrison said gravely. "Accusing a man of Radcliffe's standing of kidnapping his own daughter. I'm accusing him of hiring men to threaten Thomas, whoever he is, and those men taking matters into their own hands," Alexander clarified. "Whether Radcliffe knew they'd taken Josephine, that remains to be seen, but he bears responsibility for setting this in motion." Morrison nodded slowly. "We'll investigate thoroughly. In the meantime, Miss Radcliffe needs care and protection. I'll arrange for her to stay at a secure location until this is resolved. She can stay at Mrs. Pemberton's establishment in Boston," Alexander suggested. "My aunt runs a boarding house for ladies. Josephine would be safe there, and it's far enough from Providence that Radcliffe's influence is limited." "I'll make the arrangements," Morrison agreed. It was past midnight when Alexander finally escorted Eleanor back to the academy. They sat in the carriage in silence for a long moment, both exhausted by the evening's events. "You saved her life," Eleanor said quietly. "If we hadn't found her tonight, I don't think she would have lasted much longer." "We saved her," Alexander corrected. "If you hadn't insisted on coming, if you hadn't pieced together what really happened, we might never have found her in time." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm through her glove. "Eleanor, I need to return to Boston tomorrow. I need to confront Radcliffe, to find Thomas, to ensure Josephine gets the justice she deserves. But as soon as this case is closed, I'm coming back to Providence. I'm coming back for you." Eleanor's heart swelled. "I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere." Alexander leaned closer, his gray eyes intense in the dim carriage light. "May I kiss you? I know it's not proper. I know we should wait, but I've wanted to since the moment I saw you standing in the rain, and after everything we've been through." "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "Please, yes." He cupped her face gently with both hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her tremble. It was soft and sweet and perfect, a promise of everything yet to come. When they finally parted, both were breathing unsteadily. "I'm falling in love with you, Eleanor Grace Whitmore," Alexander said. "Perhaps I've already fallen. I've never believed in fate or destiny, but I can't help thinking you missed that train for a reason. So you could say, 'You're not alone tonight,'" Eleanor finished, remembering his words from what felt like a lifetime ago. "And I'd answer that I'm falling in love with you too, Alexander James Lockwood. Improbable as it seems, impossible as it should be, I am." They sealed the confession with another kiss, longer this time, full of promise and passion carefully restrained. When Eleanor finally entered the academy, she felt as if she were floating, exhausted but exhilarated, forever changed by the past day and night. 3 weeks later, Eleanor received a telegram. Case concluded. Josephine reunited with Thomas. Her father faces charges. Returning tomorrow. Forever yours, Alexander. When he arrived the next evening at the Academy's parlor, Alexander looked tired but triumphant. He swept Eleanor into his arms, uncaring of the scandalized headmistress watching from the doorway. Thomas was being held by Radcliffe's men, Alexander explained later, as they sat close together on the parlor sofa, his hand firmly clasped in hers. When Radcliffe learned what his hired thugs had done to Josephine, he was horrified. He'd only meant to frighten Thomas, not to harm his daughter. He's cooperating fully with the investigation, and he's given his blessing to Josephine and Thomas's marriage. "And they're truly happy?" Eleanor asked. "Deliriously so. They're planning to wed next month." Alexander paused, his expression turning serious. "Which brings me to something I need to ask you." To Eleanor's shock and delight, Alexander slid from the sofa to one knee, producing a velvet box from his coat pocket. Inside was a ring, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, the blue stone the exact color of her eyes. "Eleanor Grace Whitmore, I know this is sudden. I know we've only known each other a month, but I also know with absolute certainty that you are the woman I want to spend my life with. Will you marry me?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." As Alexander slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her hand, then her lips, Eleanor thought back to that rainy November night when she'd missed her train. She'd thought it was the worst thing that could happen. Instead, it had been the beginning of her greatest adventure, the moment when she'd found not just a partner, but her soulmate, the man who had promised she wouldn't be alone, and had kept that promise in every way that mattered. 6 months later, Eleanor Grace Whitmore became Mrs. Alexander Lockwood in a beautiful ceremony in Providence, with Josephine and Thomas among the guests. And as Eleanor walked down the aisle toward the tall, strong, impossibly handsome man who waited for her with love shining in his gray eyes, she silently thanked fate for that missed train, for the rain, for every circumstance that had brought them together.
Because sometimes the greatest love stories begin with an ending, with plans that fall apart, with a moment when everything goes wrong and someone unexpected says exactly the right words. You're not alone tonight.